So one of the things I've learned as a senior manager is you always conclude your presentation with your first slide, and then you work your way backwards from there. So when we think about the whole topic of security at Citi, there are a couple of basic facts that you have to understand. The first is bad guys are really, really good. And other speakers today have given you a sense of that, understanding the speed at which they move and how year on year they are getting more and more sophisticated. And that just creates a challenge for us. When we think about our environment, we think about a set of enemies that include nation-state actors, criminal groups, political activists, terrorist organizations, and we never forget the insider threat. And we also talk about defense in depth, okay? If you've been doing security long enough, everyone knows about defense in depth. It's a really old strategy. You put everything that's really important inside the center of a fort, and then you build multiple layers of walls around it. But that's not good enough anymore, all right? So I've been doing security for about 30 years, okay? And when I first started, we had this foolhardy notion that you could protect everything and it was on the inside. You trusted everything that was on the inside, and everything on the outside was bad. That's just a flawed strategy, and so we have to think now about prevention and detection and response together. Now, the key to Citi's information security program is we call ourselves an intelligence-led security program. So what does that mean? It means we study our enemy and we study ourselves and we create a learning organization. This is not new. So roughly like 2,000 years ago, Sun Tzu wrote this thing called The War of Art, or The Art of War. And he said, if you know your enemy and you know yourself, you need not fear the results of 100 battles. And he goes on to say that if you neither know yourself nor the enemy, you will succumb in every battle. All right, so what on earth does any of this have to do with red teaming? All right, it really comes down to the last two statements. Know yourself and be a learning organization. All right, red teaming is all about knowing yourself, understanding your own strengths and weaknesses, validating them, testing them, and then continuously learning from that experience. So why red team? Okay, our adversary, as I said, gets more and more sophisticated, all right? And so how we think about the world has to get more sophisticated. If you went back 5, 10 years ago, the basic practice was that you might ethically hack an application, you may ethically hack an infrastructure, once a year you may scan your network perimeter, and that's all well and good, but today, as our bad guys are upping their game, we also have to up our game, all right? Which means you're not just testing an application anymore, you're not just testing a piece of infrastructure anymore, you're testing a business, you're testing a business process, all right? And so that's where red teaming comes in. And this could be large scale or small scale. So at Citi, we have 125 full-time ethical hackers, all right? And we must already test 2,000 plus applications a year, and we do every piece of infrastructure that we buy, we test. But with red teaming, we do micro tests. So like we have in our thing called the Fusion Center, and so we do tests once a week. We do large red teaming events where it's red on blue, unannounced, and that's what I'll talk mostly about today. And then we also do red teaming of our employee base. So you heard a previous speaker today talk about an awareness, all right? So spearfishing your own employees is in fact a good awareness method, but it's also an important part of red teaming because your employees are the weakest link you have in all of your security processes, and if you're not sort of ethically hacking your employees, you're not doing a complete test. So we have to rethink again. And so the reality is, I don't know how many of you got to hear John Waters do his presentation earlier. He was talking about this whole idea of intel-led hunting. all right? Intel-led hunting is great, it's important, it's part of our process at Citi as well, but it's after the fact. You're looking for the bad guy who's already gotten in. So Intel-led red teams, Intel-led penetration testing is really about how you're getting ahead of the game, right? It is a preventative piece of your security program as opposed to the Intel-led hunt, which is a detective part of your security program. Now, when you're doing this, it's really important to be able to really think like the adversary. You have to study them. And I think this was part of what John talked about as well when he talked about the Intel-led hunt. In our environment, we study over 100 different adversaries that we have in our sort of list of most wanted. And we have a top 10 list just like any law enforcement agency would. And we study them all to understand what motivates them and how they do their work. And so when we build a red teaming event, it is built on that understanding. It also helps you understand holistically whether or not both the technology and the process that you've put in place is working effectively. All right? And so I think that's an important part of the red teaming experience. So who are the members of the red team? In our case, as I mentioned, we have about 125 full-time ethical hackers at Citi. And so the best of those ethical hackers are, in fact, the members of the red team. But it's also combined with our cyber intelligence group. All right? So if you think about the way a red team works, the first thing you want to do is understand who the bad guy is and what you're simulating. All right? And so that's the responsibility of my cyber intelligence team. Okay? The red team then takes that knowledge, takes that intelligence, and creates the attack. Everything from understanding, do they use spear phishing? Do they use watering holes? If they do use phishing attacks, what do their phishing emails look like? All right? What language do they tend to use? And we mimic that completely. It allows us to test our employees from a phishing perspective, and then allows us to test our security operations center and our technology. One of the things that you have to do as you think about red teaming, though, is going to be something called de-chaining. All right? So pretend you start your red team attack with phishing emails. And pretend that you've got the best employees in the world, so no one clicked on the link. Well, at some point you're going to have to say, okay, that part of the attack didn't work, but I need to test out my next layer of defense. And so what you do is de-chain. You say, okay, that didn't work. You give your red team access to machines inside the network. All right? And there may be several times throughout the process that you're going to have to de-chain as you think about the hacks that are being done. It's also important as you're doing this to have a set of trusted agents, people that are aware that the test is happening. And you may say, like, well, doesn't that skew the results? And yes, if you told your entire SOC that you're doing a red teaming event, that would skew the results. But you want to make sure a test doesn't run amok, okay? You want to make sure that if you're doing a red teaming event, the SOC manager is aware of it, so that no one's calling up your CEO and saying, oh my God, we're under attack, the world is coming to an end. Or no one is calling up a regulator and say, well, we have an hour of breach notification requirement now, so we've been breached, all right? You need trusted advisors to be agents to be able to help you say, how are you controlling the event, okay? It's really important as you're doing this that you have a real governance process around it, so there are rules of the road. You have the right project management around it. You want to be able to do this in a way that avoids risk to some degree, okay? One of the things that's different about red teaming than typical ethical hacking is that red teaming is going against live production environments, all right? You want to have an agreed set of rules of the road so that if you get to the production server that does payments, that, you know what, I've gone to that server, this is where I stop. I'm not going to actually do a $500 million funds transfer, right? That would be embarrassing if you had to call up your client and say, well, as part of an ethical hack, we accidentally shipped you $500 million. That would not be a good outcome. And so these trusted agents are important to help you understand what you're focusing on in this test and how are you going to govern the fact that where are the victory flags? How far do you go when you're declaring victory, and where do you stop before you potentially do some real harm? So, as I mentioned, this is really about an intelligence-led process. And just like the enemy, you have to have a multidisciplinary team as you're going through it. Okay? The bad guys, I mean, like, when I started out in security, you had one bad guy. He was really smart, knew everything. Today, bad guys are primarily general contractors. Your red team is going to be made up of a multidisciplinary group, and it, again, starts with the intel. All right? So think of what John Waters said about the hunt. This is the exact same thing that we're talking about here. It is really an intel-led process. So, for example, we recently did a red team event in South Korea, and it was based on a really deep study of the techniques that the North Koreans had used in previous attacks against South Korean banks and in other suspected events. All right? We did another red team where we studied the Carbonac Group, which is a criminal organization in Eastern Europe, really understood how they worked and simulated that attack against payment systems. All right? And you do this in a way that you're really testing, as I said, your end-to-end process. A lot of people have started to talk about this idea like purple teaming. All right? This is sort of red team, blue team thing. The key thing here is you will really get an understanding of whether your technology is working and whether your process is working. All right? Because the folks in your SOC are going to have to respond naturally to these events as they see alarms going off. And if alarms aren't going off, you've got some other problems that you want to work through. There are a number of different methodologies that are out there today. There's one that's been put together by a number of the major financial services organizations, this group called GFMA. Bank of England is most probably one of the first regulators to really do a lot of work on red teaming. Some of you may have heard the term CBEST. It is a test that the Bank of England came up with. And if you think about this whole idea of intelligence-led, the way the Bank of England test worked is GCHQ, their version of their military intelligence group, actually did the intelligence gathering on the banks. They understood who the employees were, they understood the nature of your network, and they then fed that into a hacking team. All right, and they went after the attacks. Hong Kong Monetary Authority has also come up with their own methodology. And if some of you heard Paul Nichols from Microsoft earlier today, I mean, this is one of those places where regulatory harmonization is really going to be critical. All right, you cannot have, I mean, Citi operates in 100 countries around the world. If even half of those regulators decided they wanted to red team me, and each of them do it in their own different way, I don't know how you would be able to tell all the good guys hacking me from the bad guys hacking me because of all of the events. And so this is an area where it is really going to be critical for us to work with our regulators on a global basis to come up with a real unified methodology for how we do these hacks. So red teaming also comes into this whole idea of situational testing. So as an example, if you go back a couple years, there was an attack by the North Koreans in the US against Sony Pictures of America. They were not happy that Sony was about to put out a movie that didn't make the leader of North Korea look so great. One of the things we did after that event happened was we got, through our intelligence process, access to all the malware that was used to attack Sony. We reverse engineered it, and we really were able to reconstruct in a very detailed fashion what that attack looked like. We then had the red team at Citi run that exact same simulation against our production environments to understand what aspects of the Sony attack would have worked against Citi and what aspects would not have. All right? You do these situational tests every time a learning opportunity comes up. So Bill Nelson earlier today talked about one of the things about the FSI SAC. It was sort of like old school day, because when I had, some of you also heard Rohan from Chase do a talk just before his. So when I had Rohan's job, I was part of the group that created the FSI SAC. Intelligence sharing is critical, and so if you aren't an ISAC member, I'm not on Bill Johnson's board or anything, on Bill Nelson's board or anything, but I really, really would suggest finding out about the new FSI SAC branch that's built here in Singapore and becoming a member, because it all starts with the intelligence you get from these things. So you want to red team every time a major bad event happens somewhere else. I think Bill had a comment in his slides about the fact that every bad thing, and I'm paraphrasing, every bad thing that happens to someone else is a learning opportunity for you. All right? Now, to really maximize the value of that learning activity, it really comes down to how you use your red team to understand what of that attack would have worked and what of that attack would not have worked. So, what then? Okay. On my very first slide, I said, you need to know yourself. Red teaming is core to knowing yourself. But I also said it's about being a learning organization. All right? If you don't actually study the results of your red teams and put together programs of work to address the weaknesses that you have found, you really haven't served yourself any great purpose in life. The reality is, when we started our major red team events, we thought we would do these like every month or two. And our experience has been that's actually too frequent. All right? You can do sort of micro tests all the time. We red team our employees with fake spear phishing all the time. But your really big red team events, you need time to actually study, learn, and remediate. Right? Because otherwise, all you're doing is finding the same weakness over again. All right? And what you want to do is give yourself time to remediate. So, as an example, in the first time we did a major red team event, it took my ethical hackers a relatively short amount of time, and we won't specify what short is, to get complete control of an aspect of my environment. 6 months later, when they did their next major event, it took them 2 orders of magnitude longer to be successful. Now, the reality is, if a bad guy really wants you, they're going to get you. What you can do through red teaming and a really good security program is really just change the level of effort required. All right? You want to make something that used to be easy to do much more difficult. And the more difficult you make it, the more opportunity you have to observe them and catch them and prevent them doing harm, prevent them from getting to that last step in the kill chain. So you go after small wins, you knock them off, you develop action plans. Sometimes you have to change policy, sometimes you have to change strategy, but be a learning organization. Observe those lessons and move forward. Thank you very much. And if people have questions, you can find me over there somewhere at the end. All right.